Anyway, my name is Jack Klasey. I think I know most of the people in this room. Apologies to my fellow historians. I'm going to begin with my favorite quote about history. I don't even know where I found this, but history is an inaccurate record of events that should not have happened, written by someone who wasn't there. And so I guess we're the people who weren't there. My writing career, which has now spanned something like 60 some odd years, began formally in 1960 when I took a job as a reporter for the Chicago Daily Calumet, a small daily newspaper out on the southeast side of the city. I took the job with the munificent salary of $50 a week, which was $1.25 an hour, and that was the minimum wage, so it was about the same as if I were flipping burgers at McDonald's, but I got you right. Did mostly, crime beat and so forth, not much history at that point. Later on, I wrote television news for a station in Milwaukee, worked for a newspaper in Wheaton. But in 1963, I took a job with the Kankakee Daily Journal. Had a wife and one or two kids at that time, Lori? One. Okay, thank you. I'm terrible. Typical father. I can't remember my kids' birthdays. But we moved to Kankakee, and like most young reporters, I figured, okay, we'll be here about 2 years, then move on to someplace bigger. That was 63 years ago, so we're still here. I worked for the Journal up until 1968, 69, somewhere in there. But that's where I got involved in history. As it happened, the year 1968 was the sesquicentennial year for the state of Illinois, its 150th birthday. And the Kankakee County Board decided that, it would be a good idea to acknowledge this milestone by publishing a book that's a comprehensive history of the county, because there was no comprehensive history of Kankakee County at that time. Mary Jean Hood, who was the accent editor of the Journal, and I were hired to research and write of the people, the popular history of Kankakee County, as it was called. By the way, the word popular is interesting here. We had an advisor who was a history professor at Olivet, and he said, we shouldn't use the word popular. Now we think of popular as, okay, whoa, this is a great big book. But he was speaking in the professional sense, where a popular history is not an academic history, but a history written for general circulation. But anyway, it turned out to be a popular history because I don't remember what the press runs were, but they eventually been out of print for years. However, about 10 years ago, Connie Lacone, who was the executive director here at the museum, and I were talking. She said, it'd be really good if we could manage to do a reprint of that book, because there's a lot of demand for it, and it's hard to find copies unless you go to garage sales. And so we approached the county board, and they said, yes, you have permission to go ahead and reprint that. And one of the improvements, actually, that was involved, we have a paperback copy of the book for sale here in the museum. One thing that makes that slightly better than the hardcover, when we were doing the hardcover original book, we were a little over-enthusiastic at how much we wrote. And the county board said, well, no, we can't bump the cost up any higher. You're going to have to get rid of some pages somewhere, and keep it in line. And so what we ended up doing, rather than cutting out text, was shortening up the table, not the table of contents, but the index. And so really the original book had really a poor index. It did not really cover things well. It had been indexed by students at Olivet, and all the index materials were on cards, the usual index cards. And a copy of it was here at the museum, and everybody sort of tended to forget it was there. We just discovered it a few years ago. And so when it came time to do the reprint, we made sure that there was a full index, so it's much easier to find something in that book now than if you had the original copy. The process of writing the book was somewhat rushed. I think we started in '67, I'm not sure when exactly, and wanted it, of course, to be out in the September year in '68. So even though we were both working full-time, we were spending all our evenings and weekends and so forth reading microfilm and going through various historical materials. I was very fortunate that Harold Simmons, who wrote the weekly up till now history column in the journal for many years, came to me one day and said, "Would you like to borrow my notebook and my scrapbooks with all of my columns in them?" And I said, "Oh yes, thank you," because it was a great resource. And so we did put it all together. And getting down toward the end, it was a little tight as far as trying to get the last copy out. And my wife played a very important role in this. She took a week and took our kids over to their grandmother's over in Rock Island and left me on my own devices for a week so that I could write nonstop. And I was literally writing nonstop. I would write until I was too tired, sleep for a while, get up, have a meal of some sort, and go back to writing again. But we got the book out, and it proved to be, a very happy situation. And ever since then, I've been hooked on history of Kankakee County. There is so much here. As probably all of you know, I write a weekly column for the Journal on history, which is called Looking Back. And that had its genesis in 2016, when Mike Fry, who was the editor of the Journal at that time, contacted me one day. He said, "Hey Jack, would you be interested in writing an occasional piece on local history here? I think that would be kind of popular with readers." I said, "Yeah, I think so, I'll do that." So the occasional only lasted for about a month. I think by the second month I was writing every week. And currently I'm somewhere, and I didn't total it up recently, between 300 and 350 columns so far written since 2016. I don't think I'm going to manage to break Vic Johnson's record, though. I think Vic was well over 500 when he stopped writing the columns. And he's still writing, by the way. But I don't know those of you who don't know him, Vic was an incredible researcher. And he still writes every day. He's in his 90s now, isn't he, Charles, you think?
Yeah. He's 2 years older than I am, so I don't...
Yeah, so I met too terrible long, several months ago, and he said, I'm writing every day. He said, I've got to do this, is what I do. So, excuse me. I've actually written a number of books, in addition to the people. I worked for 17 years as a book editor for a textbook company, and at one point an opportunity came up they had a photography textbook that the authors had reached the point where they wanted to retire and they didn't really feel like keeping it up anymore, and to be honest, it was pretty much out of date anyway. And they offered me the opportunity and said, "Would you like to take over that title and just start from scratch and write a new textbook?" Well, as it happened, I was going to Governor State University at the time and taking a lot of photography courses, so I was very interested in it anyway. So I ended up going ahead and writing photography text that is now used quite a few different high schools and community colleges across the United States. The first edition was 2002, and it's now going into its 4th edition. And I've retired from writing the newer editions. There's a young photography teacher who has taken over the continuing operation of the book. So that was book number 2. Since I've been here at the museum, I've done a lot of smaller booklet kind of things. For example, the Cigar Store Indian or Radicke Brewery. And for the Bradley House, I did their basic story of the Bradley House and what that is. And I don't know how many different smaller booklets and things I've done here. But we also are 2 books in our collection here in the story that are 100 stories from Kankakee County's colorful past, which are 100 of 50 stories. 50 stories from my columns reprinted, and after that we had another 50 more stories. So there are 2 books there, that each of which contain 50 newspaper columns from or colorful past. I'm talking about colorful past. When I first started writing the column, I thought, maybe I'll sit down and make a quick set of notes about some possible topics. Well, after I got to about the 4th page of the legal pad, I thought, I'm never going to run out of copy. I'm never going to run out of things to write about, and it's true. Sometimes they're the obvious things, like the governor's small house over there, or the story at the courthouse, or a major fire downtown, or a robbery, or sometimes just interesting people like Nils Anderson, who was an aeronaut around the turn of the late 1890s. He was one of those people who went up in a hot air balloon and then parachuted down, went to county fairs and celebrations, and I got that somebody had told me about him who was a relation of his, and he gave me the information to get started. That happens occasionally. I'll get a note from someone or a telephone call from someone saying, hey, did you ever do a story on such and such? So it's very handy to have that kind of input. One more book, actually my 3rd full-size book, and as a friend of mine named Melanie Holmes, a fellow writer, and some of you have read Melanie just sent me a note the other day saying her current book, she thinks is going to be her last one. She's tired of writing, doing all the work of writing. I think this is probably my last book too. 2 years ago, on Amazon, as an Amazon publication, I wrote a book called The Prince of Wheelwrights, the story of George Ferris and his great wheel. This is, of course, the huge Ferris wheel from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, not World Series. Getting my tongue tied. That book has a very long history. In my case, it all goes back to when we were first married. My wife happened to mention one day, because we were talking about the Columbian Exposition. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, so I was south of Jackson Park, where the Columbian Exposition was. And as a kid, I hung out at the Museum of Science and Industry, which was the arts building of the 1893 World's Fair. Anyway, Gloria and I were talking, and she said, my friend Marlene, her family has the plans for the Ferris wheel in their attic. Oh, wow, this sounds cool. So we did a little checking, and we found out, well, unfortunately, it wasn't the plans for the Ferris wheel, but it was one of the souvenir booklets. Her friend Marlene's family were distantly related to the Ferrises. Well, they allowed me to borrow the booklet and go through and make copies and so forth. And from then on, I started researching the Ferris wheel. It took me somewhat better than 50 years on and off here and there to put together the story. I mean, this is an incredible device. Ferris was an engineer who had a very successful business doing materials testing for steel, which at that point was a very new material for construction. And so he designed this wheel, which was 250 feet in diameter, and cars the size of trolley cars strung around the perimeter. Each of those cars held 40 people seated or 60 people standing room only. And it operated from June of 1893 till the fair shut down, and I believe it was October 1st. And it carried well over 1 million people at that time at 50 cents a piece. 50 cents a piece was a pretty good chunk of change in those days. Ferris unfortunately died young at the age, I believe, of 49 of typhoid fever in Pittsburgh. So he never had a chance to develop many other really interesting things. But the wheel itself had a longer life than Ferris, actually. After the 1893 World's Fair, it was dismantled and stored on railroad cars on a siding in Chicago for 2 years. Then later it was re-erected at Clark and Wrightwood in Chicago on the north side in something called Ferris Wheel Park. And it was going to be quite an amusement park with a Ferris wheel and all kinds of other things, and a beer garden, etc. Unfortunately, they ran into a lot of neighborhood opposition, mostly over the serving of beer. So the the local residents managed to do a local, I've forgotten the proper term, but they could block the use of alcoholic beverages in that area. Well, it went on until about 1903, I believe it was. Gradually losing money to the point where it finally was sold in bankruptcy for $1,800. The thought was, of course, it was bought by the Chicago House Wrecking Company, and so the thought was, of course, well, it'll probably be just cut up for scrap and sold as scrap. Now, Chicago House Wrecking Company was a pretty smart outfit. They bought it, ran it for another year or so, then dismantled it and moved it to St. Louis for the 1904 World's Fair in Fairmount Park, and it was there through the fair. Did quite well, not quite as well as it did in Chicago, but then eventually it was dismantled, was blown up. They actually dynamited one of the side supports, let it fall over and crash down. But in its day, it had a tremendous story, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading everything about it and writing all of the information. I will have to say, and this is a little bit of ego, the curator of mechanical engineering at the Smithsonian said at one point that I was the leading expert on this topic in the country. So, made me a lot of money, 50 cents and that, and get me a ride on the Ferris wheel. Well, anyway, I think that I've probably wandered on long enough here. I'd like to take any questions if there are any. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there was a bridge just.
I have a problem hearing, so I have to shout a little.
There was a bridge over the Iroquois River.
Yeah,
just
the bridge over.
east of Lorette, and it was local lore that bridge was made out of the metal from the.
Actually, the idea of a bridge built with parts of the Ferris wheel is a myth, unfortunately. It's a bridge over in Indiana on the Kankakee, and I've forgotten the name of it now, but that's often been proposed as part of it. But unfortunately, there were actually no curved members in the Ferris wheel. They were all straight because there were 36 sections, and the only thing that was curved was a cast iron set of teeth that engaged in a chain in the bottom to turn it. So, and actually, even if it had been a segment of the Ferris wheel, the bridge would have to have been 250 feet long, which would have been probably unlikely in a small place like over the Kankakee and near Rensselaer or in that area. Any other questions?
Just curious, what is the deal with the cemetery at the state park?
Cemetery at the state park?
Mhm.
At State Farm or State Park?
State park.
State Park, okay.
Mhm.
That was a cemetery from a family that owned that land, a local cemetery as I recall. Ken, you know more because you were a conservation officer.
Cooper Cemetery.
Was it?
It was called the Cooper Cemetery.
Cooper Cemetery, for the Cooper family that
Yeah.
owned all the land there. And apparently when the state set up the state park, they didn't want to disinter the people who were buried there. There are no new burials there. There haven't been burials there for many, many years.
And what did they die from?
Where is he from?
No, what did they die from?
Oh, I don't know.
Typhoid might
It's
have
just a
been.
family plot, people died and buried there.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. And about 30 years ago, it was in really bad disrepair. Nobody was taking care of it, and the Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society contacted the Park District office to get permission to go out and clean it all up.
Mhm.
They couldn't get permission, but the state immediately started cleaning it up themselves because they didn't want any notoriety.
Oh, wow.
Sure.
Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you very much for all of your patience and enjoyment, I hope, of all of our speakers today. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah.